pleasure to welcome our host and everyone joining us today for this final installment of our spring webinar series. So I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Tom Fleischner, calling in from Prescott, Arizona. And I met Dr. Fleischner about a year ago and was almost immediately searching for ways to work with him. I was struck by the expansiveness of his work and his fascination and wonder about the connections between nature and humans. He's currently the executive director of the Natural History Institute, a nonprofit which seeks to revitalize the practice of natural history by integrating art, science, and the humanities. He's also faculty emeritus at Prescott College, where he created experiential coursework that linked disciplinary theories, methodologies, and tools in conservation biology, natural history, as well as creative writing and ecopsychology, among others. So I could go on and on about Tom's work, especially his most recent book, but let's hear directly from him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fleischner.
Thank you, Christine. Let's see here. Okay, everybody see that okay? Let's see here, 1 second. Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction, Christine. I wanted to start by saying that if you have questions or comments along the way, please don't hesitate. I'd like to have this as interactive as possible. I'm a newbie to the webinar world, so if you can just go ahead and type in anything on the chat box if you have something you'd like to bring up. I probably won't catch the hand wave little deal. So starting essentially with a confession that I am absolutely a newbie to the world of webinars, both as a participant or a speaker. So it's a bit new to me. I'm used to speaking to lots of people, but usually when I can look them in the eye. So I'm kind of metaphorically trying to look you all in the eye. So as Christine said, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go, called the Natural History Institute. And that was after and grew directly out of 29 years of working in an interdisciplinary environmental studies program at Prescott College here in Prescott, Arizona. So, whoops, my slides are not advancing. There we go. Okay, so basically what I had in mind is essentially to try to give you a little bit of context for who I am and the kind of work that I've been doing as examples of perhaps different kinds of interdisciplinary work than some of you are doing or that others that you've heard from. And then hopefully that would lead into a discussion on some of the best practices for interdisciplinary collaboration. I know you all are spending a huge amount of great effort on that, and so I'm hoping to, I will say in advance, I don't have lots of answers, but maybe can help us think about some things in some new ways. So I said my own checkered past. That basically, that checkered really means interdisciplinary, which is a good thing in this group and maybe not everywhere that all of us have worked in the past. And so just a few sort of autobiographical details as part of that sort of checkered past. It took me 3 different colleges and several years to get through undergraduate school. And that was partly because of my wide-ranging interests. I began college as a political philosophy major, studying Marx and Lenin and American government and intending to go to law school and get involved in radical politics, etc. And actually for the first 2 years of my undergraduate experience, I actively and intentionally avoided anything having anything to do whatsoever with science. And then had a sort of conversion experience partway through that was basically prompted by a field botany course, and ended up spending the second half of my education completely doing field biology, ecology, and field geology. And so I ended up with a BS in field biology. Then spent several years immersed in field biology in different ways, ranging from studying harbor seals in Puget Sound, to large whales in the Alaskan Arctic, to reintroduction of Atlantic puffins to an island in Maine, and then a master's thesis project also in Washington State on harlequin ducks that you see the bottom there. So for several years, I was an itinerant field biologist, having moved at that point beyond the political philosophy origins, but they were bound to sort of reintegrate into my life. My next kind of phase was really focused a lot around wilderness education, and by that I mean intensive long-term educational experiences, mostly in the backcountry. A lot of this was done through a program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and those programs, in my case, were largely done in the Colorado Plateau of southern Utah and the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, both of which you see here. And so those were season-long immersive programs, all of which were interdisciplinary by design. In there also got very much involved in public lands management, working for several years in summers at North Cascades National Park, you see here in Washington State. Again, so working kind of within the, you might say, the confines of a government land management agency and trying to find the boundaries of what was possible to do in that context. The North Cascades, as some of you may know, is an incredibly wild country. Most of the glaciers in the lower 48 are there, and so on and so forth. So a really pretty wild landscape. I worked both as an interpretive naturalist giving programs and also as a backcountry ranger roaming in the backcountry. That led pretty directly to trying to fulfill a dream that several friends and I had that had developed over several years, which was we wanted to found and start a school, an environmental field school. Two of us that you see, so the ne'er-do-wells at the bottom of the screen there, ended up actually making that happen eventually, and working directly in relationship first with North Cascades National Park and then eventually with 3 different national forests in that area, and also some transboundary issues with Canada, creating an organization called the North Cascades Institute, which is still going strong and is a wonderful organization, also doing a lot of interdisciplinary work, as you see there, connecting people, nature, and community. So that was a major project. But that led me eventually to coming here to Prescott, Arizona, where I started teaching, as we already said, at Prescott College, a small liberal arts college that has, and you can see none of these images look like your standard liberal arts classroom. So there was a lot of focus here, and still is, on interdisciplinarity is built right into the mission statement of the college, as is experiential education. So in addition to extensive, lots of more traditional classroom kinds of settings in environmental studies, also lots and lots of field work, like a summer program to Alaska that you see here, courses in Mexico, also, well, all over, and even in classroom-based courses, oftentimes many days of the course would be spent on day trips into the field. And I might highlight that this is an environmental studies program, not an environmental science program. So environmental science was at the core of that, but by intention and design, the program really tried to force or help students embrace interdisciplinarity and pull together threads from public policy, from humanities, from literature, and so on and so forth. So that was the core of my work for the better part of 3 decades. And here, just to give you a sense, these are the different courses that I taught during that time. And roughly half of those classes are pretty, by design, focused on interdisciplinarity. For example, Ideologies of Nature was a class I taught with a political philosopher, political theorist, integrating social and ecological perspectives, of course, specifically designed to try to break down what I see as a very false dichotomy between social justice and ecological concerns, a false dichotomy that unfortunately I think in many people's minds has gotten firmer instead of been dispensed with. Nature and Psyche, which was trying to link ecology, natural history, and psychology. Actually, one person on the seminar here today was a part of that and assisted with that class, et cetera, et cetera. So again, interdisciplinary coursework, sort of the name of the game for most of my career. Along the way, I began to put more and more energy into writing in a variety of kinds of formats. So lots of journal articles and kind of maybe perhaps more typical academic kind of writing, but also more and more writing for the general public. So that has led to, in addition to a lot of journal articles, 4 different books. Christine mentioned one in the introduction, which is the one you see in the bottom left there, which came out last year, Nature, Love, Medicine, Essays on Wildness and Wellness, which will tie into some things I'll talk about here in a minute. So again, lots of effort to kind of communicate with larger worlds and in explicitly interdisciplinary and sort of boundary crossing ways through writing. So in all of this work for all these years, I became more and more convinced and focused upon this, that the idea that so much environmental work seems to be about grief, and for good reason, of course, because there is so much loss and erosion that happens around us. But it also, and I think that the process of grieving is incredibly important, but so is the process of loving the world. I was once, a number of years ago, which is when this really struck me, I was asked to give a keynote address for an Earth Day week kind of set of events, and I realized that everything that had been on the agenda for that whole week was all about how sad we were. And I felt that that was not, ultimately the salvation did not lie solely along a path of grief, and that it was important to kind of embrace the importance of loving the world. And that has become more and more explicit in my work. Thus, for example, the title of the book I just mentioned, Nature, Love, Medicine. So this was coincident with, again, more and more explicitly as time went on, I started thinking about more and more about the term natural history, which is probably a term that all of us are familiar with. Probably many have not thought that much about what it means. It probably might conjure up images of dusty museums or grade school field trips to an old museum or something like that. But the term has been with us for 2,000 years, and Historia Naturalis, the original Latin, actually translates as the story of nature. And stories, I think, are what motivate us and guide us in the world. And so being very clear about what sorts of stories we want to be telling and want to be listening to, I think, is super important. So years ago, one of the first efforts I ever made at trying to articulate some of this, I came up with this definition of natural history, which is a more expansive or broader definition than most that you would see. Many times it's seen as sort of a subset of biology or natural sciences at least, but I actually think that natural history is not just a subset of sciences. It's actually something much larger than sciences alone. It's a practice of attentiveness and receptivity to the world around us. So I also started more and more explicitly starting to define, in some cases, natural history as simply this: the practice of falling in love with the world. It's the attentiveness to the world around us is what engages us, inspires us to be in love with the world and therefore to care for it and have the capacity and the motivation to solve problems. So this, while this is not strictly a scientific notion, again, something much broader than science, it does resonate pretty directly with the idea that E.O. Wilson came up with back several decades ago, this idea of biophilia, which he defined as the innate urge to affiliate with other forms of life. And I think that this is a really important idea that is part of what we're playing with here. And as we, just as a kind of reminder, if we're thinking about natural history as a practice of falling in love with the world, there is endless opportunities around us to fall in love. And let's just share a few images with you from my own path, the last handful of years. And the idea, the reminder that the world that we live in is a remarkable, miraculous place that we tend to take too much for granted or treat too much as an abstraction. And I think part of what the practice of natural history does as a practice of attentiveness is it reminds us to get beyond abstraction, something academia, of course, values and urges us to do. And abstraction is great, but sometimes the process of over-abstraction causes us to forget the tangible realities of the world, whether they're landscapes like these, and these are both the North Cascades, by the way, or remarkable organisms that inhabit the earth with us. And moments that if we are lucky enough and determined enough to be out in the world enough, we are graced with moments like this and so many others. And these are all from some fairly spectacular places, but I think one part of the point is that you can walk out the door almost anywhere and find miracles, especially on an April morning like today, probably wherever we all are. So why does all this matter? I've sort of tried to allude to a few things, but in another writing project a number of years ago, wrote this, that we are what we pay attention to. And as the years have gone by, I have more and more come to believe that this is true. I sort of wrote it, frankly, kind of offhandedly and in a rush in a larger context, but I do believe that we are what we pay attention to, and I think there's actually some neuroscience support for that idea. So what do we pay attention to, or what do people in the modern world especially pay attention to? Well, increasingly, it is things like this. And that is of great concern for a whole lot of reasons, many of which are obvious, but also the idea that instead of visually and sensorially engaging with the textures of the world around us, we are increasingly engaged with a two-dimensional surface that is always the same distance from our eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of issues with that, again, in terms of neuroscience, as well as just psyche in the broader sense, and our lack of connection with the world around us. And I think those are deep concerns. So along the way, this is actually while I was still at Prescott College, a number of years ago, well, about, a dozen years ago, with a handful of colleagues around the country, who were all concerned about some of these same things, we started this nonprofit organization called the Natural History Network. Actually, we originally came together virtually, that is, through phone calls and whatnot. But our original intention was to compile a book about the importance of natural history. But the more we talked, we felt like a book might just be good and useful for a short while and then would be forgotten, and we wanted to create a more ongoing engaging resource. And so we started this organization that had a website. We started a journal, which actually still exists, called the Journal of Natural History, Education, and Experience. This article you see there was the kickoff article in that journal, and so on and so forth. And that's part of the mission statement that you see on the screen. And the network played a really important role. And one of those things was that it led very directly to this project, which took place in 2011. The network generated the idea to do this, and then ultimately we got two of us through our home institutions, Prescott College and the University of Washington, were able to get National Science Foundation funding to convene a series of gatherings, in-person gatherings, over the course of a 6-month period to brainstorm ideas on the Renaissance in natural history. Again, it was very interdisciplinary. Lots of scientists because of the NSF funding, but also, at each one we had artists, we had poets, and so on and so forth. One of the specific projects that came out of that was this called the Natural Histories, plural, project, which you can still find online through our website at the Natural History Institute. But these are a series of dialogues that happened between participants in these workshops, and they were snippets excerpted out from about 100 different people, and really fascinating listening that you might want to check out. So it says, listen to conversations on the rebirth of natural history. It's literally conversations. Okay, so the Natural History Network played a really important role, but after a number of years, when certain people changed and so on and so forth, it began to sort of fade away a little bit. And so while still at Prescott College, I commenced a new program there called the Natural History Institute. So the Natural History Institute started as a program at Prescott College to do both internal and also public outreach programs. But then, it's a long story, but a little less than 2 years ago, the Institute, we went independent from the college. And so we are now an independent 501c3 nonprofit. And here's our mission statement, and sort of our tagline and all of our literature and so on is, and Christine mentioned this, integrating art, science, and humanities. And so part of what we're trying to do is to model interdisciplinarity, and specifically to model the kind of interdisciplinarity that integrates art, science, and humanities in sort of healing the relationship between humans and nature. So just a few different ideas, or a few different approaches to that. This is just directly from our website, but you can see there's a number of different kinds of activities and just a few examples. So we have a beautiful art gallery here with changing exhibits. Right now we have an exhibit with original pieces by Audubon and Mark Catesby and kind of classic natural history authors, but we alternate things like that with very contemporary work like you see in the upper left. We also have scientific collections, part of which you see on the bottom left, and we increasingly are trying to work at the humanities side of things. One of our advisory council members is the wonderful poet Jane Hirschfield, who has helped us integrate some aspects of that, such as, and you see some evidence of that on the bottom right. And we have readings and original, literary works. We have a book club, and so on and so forth. One of the ongoing things we do is we have a public lecture series, which is roughly every 2 weeks. We have a public lecture in our theater space. And these, again, are very interdisciplinary by design and by nature, ranging from things on biology of the sociobiology of ants to fisheries issues in the Gulf of California, Mexico, to things on Buddhist understandings of awe in nature. So really across the gamut. And these are all free to the public. We have a science research agenda, which we're developing more, and a lot of that focuses on trying to define and describe the area where we live, which we have named the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion, an area which actually turns out to be one of the most biodiverse parts of the whole North American continent, but which has been largely ignored by scientists just through sort of historical happenstance of where research centers are located and so on. We try to get people directly into the field by leading both short day trips, but also more extended expedition-like trips. These both shots here are from trips we've done to Ecuador, also trips to Mexico and other places. We call these touchstone tours. And the kind of grandest undertaking we've made, and this is, I think, a great example of the kind of thing we're trying to do, and also just of interdisciplinary intention, is we're putting together a national gathering. We're calling it a confluence, basically a conference, this fall here in Arizona in Sedona at a retreat center called Reciprocal Healing, Nature, Health, and Wild Vitality. And we are seeing this as a confluence of three major sort of streams of wisdom and knowledge. One is natural history, one is medicine, and one is psychology, and bringing leaders and practitioners from all those areas together to try to bring attention to essentially the healing power of nature, and how when we help heal nature, we help heal ourselves, and vice versa. So that, if anybody's interested in learning more about that, I'd love to tell you more about that. But as you can see, it's happening this November in Sedona. Okay, so finally, that's kind of the context and the biography part. So I'm hoping that we can have a bit of discussion on how to practice interdisciplinarity. And as you can get from this context that I've shared about some of my own work, that my own experience has been largely in academia, but also in several different settings in the nonprofit sector as well, and then briefly back in the day through government agencies as well. And so, what are best practices? I wish I had great answers I could just lay out for you, but I did, as I sat and thought about this over the past week or so, a few things came to mind. And one of those is simply this, like, if not you, who? I think there's especially in very large traditional university type settings, I think there's, as probably many of you know better than I, not always a lot of support for doing interdisciplinary work, and because we tend to be very departmentalized. And so it takes somebody deciding that I'm the one that's going to do it, and if I don't do it, who is going to do it? And I've had a number of those kind of moments in my own path. For example, I showed you the North Cascades Institute and the two scurrilous young lads who began that without having any institutional backing behind them at the start. Another example is that was more from within the realm of the sciences, but 25 years ago, I became increasingly concerned just from my own travels in the backcountry of the American West with the tremendous ecological damage that was happening from livestock grazing, and so I began to check into that and try to learn more about that. First, what were the damages, and also how did that come to be as a historical and public policy kind of issue? And spent several years actually preparing the paper that you see on the bottom there, which was in the journal Conservation Biology. Ended up chairing a public policy committee that you see part of at the top, and many, many other things. But to be able to do that, it required delving into the technical literatures of all of these fields and others as well to be able to pull things together. And again, if not you, who? So that's just one example. Another thing is simply this, and I'm sure that everybody on this webinar has their own examples of this, but it does, I think because it's sort of out of the box a little bit, especially in academia, it takes courage to be able to collaborate, especially in interdisciplinary ways where you cannot take for granted or assume that people share your basic outlooks on the world, your basic assumptions about what matters. And there's a vulnerability in that. And so that's the courage involves in being okay with that vulnerability. And that leads to this, is that interdisciplinary collaboration really takes having not just an open mind, which it does, but also an open heart, that you have to be willing, able, and prepared to feel that kind of emotional space of connecting with another person, often in unexpected ways. And I think that part of the work of interdisciplinary collaboration is actually the emotional work to be able to connect, and not just intellectual work. And this is very clear, and I'm sure everybody here has had their own experiences with this, is that hierarchies and the status quo work very hard to maintain themselves. And so that, in my experience, has led to really different kinds of limiting factors in those different collaborative contexts or interdisciplinary contexts of academia, government, and nonprofit worlds. In some cases, it's about what does or doesn't get prestige in academia. A lot of it is what does or doesn't, lead towards tenure, promotions, and things like that. What kind of journals do you have to publish in to be able to get that kind of upward mobility in a career? In some cases, it's about money and power. Very straightforwardly, that certainly can be the case in government context. If in my situation in the National Park Service, if different supervisors had been in place who were not so oriented towards being creative and interdisciplinary, we would not have been able to do some of the things we did there. And that's also true in terms of the nonprofit world. In the example of the North Cascades Institute, that was able to get started because a key collaborator in a powerful position in the National Park Service wanted to make something happen. Again, different people would not have been so easy. So finding the right collaborators is certainly key as well. So that's basically what I have to lay out. And again, it's kind of surreal for me, not used to doing this, because here I am talking and I don't see anybody. I don't even see myself, actually. But so I'm really curious what your ideas are, and what your ideas are about possible best practices or things that one might keep in mind. And I'm happy to answer any questions about anything that I brought up. So, anything?
Thanks so much, Tom. That was really, really awesome. I want to open up the floor to questions, or if anyone has any ideas that they'd like to share with the group, please go ahead.
And I can just barely hear you, Christine.
Okay, here we go again.
That's much better.
Okay, thank you so much again. And I just want to open up the floor to anyone if you've got questions, or if you want to add any ideas that you'd like to discuss with the group.
Hi, so this is Christine Hendren, and I thought that was fantastic. I took copious notes. I love the power of an individual narrative that you're telling of your story, to kind of put an example to the different ways that it feels to be trying to make an interdisciplinary path happen. And I really appreciate your focus on the fact that in the moment it might feel counter to what your incentives are, and that it still might not be a bad idea to go toward what is pulling you. So I wondered if you had any examples, maybe to of times when you thought, is this pie in the sky? Should I not be doing this? Should I be, building up a pile of beans that's going to be counted by somebody who cares about those beans instead of the path I'm going on? Or did you just always have that internal compass really strongly oriented for yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you for your comments and your question. It's a good one. I guess, I don't know, saying the internal compass being strong sounds a little bit grandiose. But I think I did always I was pretty driven to do this sort of thing. Really just because it's kind of what turned me on, and intellectually and emotionally, and it's kind of clearly what excited me. And it also, after a while, and to the extent that I thought about those kind of things, I think incentive is a good word that you used. It became clear to me that what I really had to offer the world was more about integration and bringing things together than about being the world expert in any one little thing. And even if I could have corralled myself enough to focus on the same thing over and over. And I think different people are different. I'm totally, as is hopefully obvious, a fan of interdisciplinarity and integration, but I also would be the first to say that you can't integrate if you don't have specialists that are building the pieces to integrate. But I'm just not that person. And so I also would say that I, for better or for worse, was at an institution for many years that, well, you could say that it didn't bean count in the normal way, and it also didn't have that many beans. So there wasn't some of the same kinds of incentives. Prescott College, for example, doesn't even have a tenure program. So there wasn't a tenure review you had to go through, and its whole curriculum was built on integration. So in many ways, it was easier for me, and a lot of people, some of this grazing work that I actually have still been involved with on and off over all these years, mentioned that, that one paper that I showed you got tremendous response from all over the world and still gets cited all the time and blah, blah, blah. But I think that it was not a surprise that came out of somebody at a little out of the mainstream institution. And again, that was probably easier for me to do that than somebody at a range management program at a big university. But to your main point, I do think that individuals need to follow their heart and their passion. And obviously everybody is in this group because there's passion for that integration and bringing things together. And I applaud that and encourage everybody to keep doing what you're doing. I'd like to learn more about what all those individual paths are as well. So thanks. Yeah. And I see a question just popped up on the screen. Terry Campbell. I think you can all see this, but I'll just read it in case. That academics often have problems finding non-academic collaborators. Any ideas on how to do this? Oh, that's interesting. Nothing comes to mind immediately. That's really interesting because, again, having been my academic home for so long was in a very small institution with very permeable boundaries. So I actually never, I never faced that particular issue. That's a really good one. I'll have to think more about that. And if I think of something, I can get in touch with you. And I also, by the way, just put up my contact information up on the screen. And if anybody else has an idea, in answer to Terry's question, please chip in. But I think it's interesting because I guess my sense in my time in the nonprofit world is that the reverse is also somewhat true. That nonprofit people, especially in like conservation organizations and nonprofit sort of research, sort of think tanks or whatever, are always looking for academic collaborators who might bring some resources and some expertise. So I've heard the same thing in the other direction. So I'm not sure how we get each other all talking to each other more. I think your group is one good way of doing that. Conferences are one possibility. the Natural History Institute, that's part of what we're trying to be, as sort of a bridge between a lot of worlds. But that's an interesting question. I'll have to keep thinking about that. And a question from Chris: any ideas of how to manage the conflict of interests among collaborators? Well, I think that's where the open heart has to come in. Really, really key is it's so easy to, and I think sometimes as academics we're inclined to think that we have the expertise, and so we'll come in and we'll tell people how it really is or whatever. And so conflicts of interest sometimes can come from that sort of thing, which is more sort of like ego kinds of issues, not necessarily just from us, but from others. But so I think being ready to be changed is one thing. But certainly I've been involved in a lot of things like this, and probably not, I mean, the first example that comes to mind is a lot of this grazing kind of issue. So as I'm not sure where you're all from, but in the Mountain West, there is no more contentious social political issue than the use of land and livestock grazing. That has a really fascinating history, and more land is dedicated to that than any other single use. And there's been a very privileged history of that getting preeminence. And so anytime one is challenging that in any way, or seem to be challenging that, there's conflicts of interest, and that's where I've sort of had to deal with it. And a lot of it is just trying to maintain a center of humility, even and holding in conflict two things, simultaneously, which is a sense of humility and willingness to listen, but also feeling like I've got something to offer here too. So I know that's a insufficient answer. And again, if anybody else has ideas on either any of these questions, please chip in.
I think all of that is really great, Tom, and I'm just struck by that in addition to your bringing in different disciplines into your work, there's so much emotionality, and you express so much emotionality and the importance of emotionality in your work. So yeah, I love that that's where your heart comes in.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's interesting you say that, because the first significant publication I ever had was in the journal Conservation Biology, and the title was Integrating Science and Passion in Conservation Education. The idea that essentially, and so I taught conservation biology for all those years. I was at Prescott College, and on the first day, I would always say to people, facts and feelings are both important. That you have to know the facts and understand the facts, but people really make their decisions based on feelings, and we try to then build both of those things. So yeah, that has been a pretty explicit in a lot of my work for a long time. And again, that's one of those things where there's a vulnerability, certainly within academia, in expressing that, and certainly in the realm of sciences in particular. So it's become almost funny at first when I started in recent years, actually specifically talking about love as a component of natural history and of saving the world. And it's almost humorous how scared people are of using that word. So I kind of figure, like, what have I got to lose, but yeah.
To me, this it kind of falls along your theme of just spanning boundaries generally. And so the idea that you've kind of deconstructed the existence of externally imposed boundaries between parts of understanding the system. So if they're disciplinary boundaries, fine. If they're sectoral boundaries, fine. And then even the types of energy or strength within yourself and what type of thinking you're doing or thinking and feeling, it kind of feels like it's all along this theme of not being beholden to reductionistic tendencies and really looking at this holistically. So, I mean, I think your tendencies that you've just described here in dismantling some of those arbitrary boundaries that keep us limited would be the same things you probably would do to work with people outside academia. When you were thinking about that answer, it struck me that probably you might not even register a barrier between academia and not, because it feels like your ideas and your trajectory toward getting them across are such a strong kind of vector for you that those other boundaries are a little bit dissipated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly seen as much rigidity within academia as within the rest of the world, and wonderful, open-hearted and minded people in both places as well. But it's yeah. Thank you for that. I see another comment here in tiny little writing. Alex, can you? I think you can all see these, right? Yes. Yeah, Alex is referring to. So when I was first starting some of this work on grazing, before I had published any of it, I was invited to give a talk at the Arizona. The annual conference of the Arizona chapter of the Society for Range Management, which, if you're not familiar with that whole world, is kind of the heart of the beast of sort of status quo, ranching as it has been done for over 100 years. And so I gave a talk on I think it was called Enlarging Our Perspective, Managing Rangelands for Biodiversity. And there was I overheard people in the hallway before I talked already planning how they were going to tear me apart. And their responses had much less to do with what I actually said than it did with the emotionality of what they perceived as a threat. And I actually wrote about that as an excerpt in one of those books. So it can be very challenging for sure. And that takes, again, the emotional work of being able to respond in the moment to that with a certain sense of calm, at least the best facsimile of calm you can conjure when you're being attacked in a public space like that. Citizen science, also integrating science, is yes, absolutely. I think citizen science is a wonderful trend, actually, and citizen science is a wonderful kind of whole impetus that is not just an impetus for interdisciplinary activity, although it can be, but it also can be very disciplinary. People focusing on one particular thing, censusing moths in their neighborhood or something like that isn't interdisciplinary, but nevertheless is important because it's engaging people really deeply and also validating the importance of their observations and the fact that the world isn't divided into a small handful of experts and then the rest of us who what we do or focus on doesn't matter. But certainly a lot of that can be interdisciplinary, and I mean, one really fun kind of thing that some of you might be aware of is that there's a trend for doing things in local communities that are called bio-blitzes, where an organization, and ours is actually considering doing it here, will organize, it's usually a 24-hour period where they mobilize as many amateur naturalists, amateur, by the way, means one who loves, and mixed in with professional specialists in areas and try to document every living thing they can in a certain radius over the course of 24 or 48 hours. So that can be interdisciplinary, and it also can be very specialized, but regardless, super positive way of connecting people in the world around them and each other. So Anything else?
Okay, well, if there, oh, Christine.
Well, I don't want to dominate, but I do have a question for you to follow up. I'm coming from an R1 institution, and we are, trying to make this Intereach community a place where people can talk about being a person whose career is dedicated to that integration work.
Right.
And I was really intrigued by what you mentioned, being at a place that was a smaller liberal arts college. Do you feel like, generally speaking, for somebody that really wants to be maybe more free to pursue interdisciplinary pathways, that a route of being at a teaching college or maybe not an R1 institution, from what you've seen, is it more possible on that route for folks who are trying to do that with their careers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't deign to assume that I understand all of the ins and outs of that, but I have worked closely with people at R1 institutions and lots of small liberal arts colleges as well. And I would, I think in general, I mean, and this is just an impression, and like I say, I don't think I have the right to proclaim anything too definitively, but I think in some ways, it's the smaller the institution, the easier it is to innovate a little bit and to have the capability, because there's not as much overarching structure that is in place, and that your job is just to fit in and hold up this little piece of this gigantic institution. That said, I've seen a lot of small liberal arts colleges that are every bit as rigid as any other, and I've seen some wonderful innovation at some huge R1 universities. And so I think so much of it comes down to the individual people, back to that issue, and where I've seen wonderful innovation in the big research universities, it's usually because there's one or two people, probably like some of you all, who are really open to it, seeking it out, and fostering it and encouraging that in perhaps younger colleagues or whatever, and making, you might say, a safe space for it within the big universities. And I think I guess I just want to be really clear that I think that the work that, what I perceive, my understanding of what many of you are doing, is like super important. And it shouldn't just be happening from these little outlier places, although I think it always will. And I think a lot of, like I said, I think it's often not coincidental that a lot of really integrative ideas come from out of the core, but outside of the core. But then I think the work in that core, at the big of academia in this case, is incredibly important. And so in some ways it might be that those people in little places like like my situation is like throwing ideas into the mix and then hoping that they get picked up in other places. But those sparks fly in big institutions as well. So it's really about trying to, in whatever institutional setting one is in, trying to make that be a nurturing, fostering kind of place, at least in a small way. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tom. We really appreciate your time, and we're just, absolutely blown away by the work you're doing. And Christine says to me, so good for the world.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. And obviously on the screen, sitting there for a while, I've been in these different addresses. So feel free to get in touch if there's any specific questions you have. Would encourage you to look at the website, the top one there of the Institute. Also the middle address is my own personal website, and most of the papers and whatnot that I've published over the years are all downloadable from there and whatnot. And that's my email at the bottom. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.